Welcome to What We Believe. Our topic is Loving the Poor, Catholic Social Responsibility Today. It is our second discussion exploring what we commonly call Catholic social teaching. It continues a discussion which really began several talks ago when we discussed the Catholic moral vision, the integral vision as we described it, and also a discussion about conscience. Last time, you'll remember, in part one of our discussion about Catholic social teaching, we looked at the roots of Catholic social teaching, or again, what I like to call social responsibility. In this talk, we're going to survey the Church's tradition regarding social teaching, looking at some of the pivotal moments in the Church's history, concluding with an overview, as best as I can do, of modern Catholic teaching. So to dive right in, we finished our discussion last time of the New Testament. You'll remember noticing that the Church was basically organized toward helping the poor. We didn't have all sorts of positions that we have today in the Church, business managers or faith formation directors or so on and so forth. Everything was geared to serve the poor. The parish and Catholic charities, for example, imagine them sort of put together. Property was sold, and the money was given to the apostles for the distribution of the poor. Deacons were finally brought on board to help with that, and so they had to be honest and trustworthy, as we read in the New Testament. We notice again in the New Testament that widows were enrolled and looked after by the Church, and so on and so forth. You remember also from our discussion of the liturgy that the word liturgia had a double meaning. It meant not only sacred service or worship, as we call it, but it also meant service to the poor. For example, you remember when famine struck Jerusalem, Paul described the collection given to the suffering Christians in the Holy Land as liturgia, right? We see this in 2 Corinthians and also Romans 15 and elsewhere. For the ministry of this liturgias is not only the supplying of needs of the saints, but also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. There in Romans, for they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them, for if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessing, they ought also to be a liturgicai to them in material blessings. So this organization toward the poor, as I like to describe it, didn't stop with the New Testament, obviously. It continued through the centuries. Justin Martyr, who you may remember gives us such a really good description of the celebration of the Eucharist in mid to late 2nd century Rome. He also gives us a good description of how these early Christians were organized toward the poor. We see in this passage from Justin Martyr's First Apology. And they who are well-to-do and willing give what each thinks fit, and what is collected is deposited with the president, who succors the orphans and widows, and those who through sickness or any other cause are in want, and those who are in bonds, and the strangers sojourning among us, and in a word takes care of all who are in need. So the principle under this, which should be clear by now, the principles, I should say, go all the way back to Deuteronomy 15. There should be no poor among you. You remember it says in that text, and this principle of solidarity was now transferred to the Church, right? We know also from other sources that early Christians were known to care for the poor who were not just Christians, but the non-Christian poor as well, right? Because they would have viewed them as sojourners, just as the Hebrews and the Israelites, cared for the sojourners in their midst, theoretically. And as I said, the Christians were known for this, and we can see this in by example, by way of Julian the Apostate, who was this 4th century Roman emperor. He was a convert to paganism from Christianity. Very interesting person, and he actively tried to revive pagan religions and destroy Christianity. And one of the ways he did that, he tried to imitate Jewish and Christian philanthropy. We have evidence of it in a rather famous passage from a letter of his, which you see, letter 22. In every city establish hostels in order that strangers may benefit from our benevolence, Julian says. For it is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, which is what he called the Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us, right? So there you see Julian trying to sort of copy Jews and Christians in how they cared for the poor. Now, this Christian practice of philanthropy existed against the backdrop of a different social imagination, a more classical Greco-Roman idea built around the notions of polis, the city-state, and notions of citizenship. And we talked about this when we talked about Liturgia in our discussions on the liturgy. Again, just to sort of refer to this wonderful little book by Susan Holman, which she just gives a very concise summary of the Greco-Roman idea of liturgias. She says, in the Greco-Roman world, these liturgies were public fiscal obligations of members of the leading class to their fellow citizens, and their fulfillment could be onerous, right? They could break the bank. In fact, it was the wealthy hosting sort of a festival or games for one's son or nephew or something. The wealthy were meant to sort of tempt bankruptcy by taking on the honor of these public works, right? And they often involve like large buildings or as I said, financing festivals or games. But it also involved providing charity for the poor citizenry of one's political community, one's polis, right? That is, the poor, if they belong to the political community as citizens, then they were cared for by the wealthier members of that society, right? This is before the modern welfare state. And so the social imagination was oriented toward helping citizens, those who belonged, in a sense, politically. Now, the problem with that is, what if the person didn't belong politically? If you couldn't be classified as a citizen or some other sort of publicly recognized category of person, then that person had a much harder time benefiting from any sort of philanthropy at all. For example, if you're an unattached woman or disabled or an orphan, receiving social aid, as we'd call it, immensely more difficult, right? And so philanthropy in the Greco-Roman idea was enveloped more the people who politically mattered in the classical world, right? This is summarized well by a gentleman we'll be following throughout this talk a lot, Peter Brown, a wonderful little book called "Poverty and Leadership in the Later Roman Empire." He said it was always the city, right, that in the first instance the recipient of gifts, or if not the city, the civic community, the demos, or the populace of the city. It was never just the poor, right? So there's always sort of a political categorization, a political inflection to philanthropy. This book, by the way, this little book by Peter Brown, which is wonderful, was sort of improved upon and eclipsed by another work by Peter Brown 10 years later called The Eye of the Needle, but the basic thesis, the argument he makes is the same. That's the idea, this Greco-Roman idea of philanthropy gearing in or enveloping the polis, the citizenry, so to speak. It's this which changed, Peter Brown said, with at least beginning with Constantine. Peter Brown makes clear that it didn't happen all of a sudden. The Christianization of the Western world, really went on into the 6th century. It wasn't like flipping a light switch at all, right? But it began, one could fairly say, with the age of Constantine. And again, to follow Peter Brown here, he says, thus, when Constantine decided to patronize the Christian church in 312, he found a body committed to a double charge, a duty to give to the poor and a duty to give to the clergy, right? He also found among the Christian laity many well-to-do persons who had long been alerted to the need to scrutinize the clergy whom they themselves supported, to ensure that their money was spent to good effect. An ideology that linked the wealth of the church to the care of the poor, and that made the clergy responsible for that care, was firmly established in Christian circles before the conversion of Constantine. So we notice Peter Brown saying, and I think he's right, as if Peter Brown needs my endorsement, but the coming together of two social visions, right? Two visions of social welfare, I should say. One is this Christianized version of the Hebrew covenant ideal, going all the way back to Deuteronomy 15, as we've talked about, and the other is this Greek, slightly more political notion of philanthropy at the service of the citizenry, right, of the demos, and so you get these two philanthropic visions coming together with the Christianization of the Roman Empire, which caused a shift, a rather significant shift, in that the Greek vision, the Greco-Roman vision, gave way to the Christian vision, or they converged, or they blended in a significant way. And so, following again Peter Brown, he says, although the conversion of Constantine brought a Christian church, previously characterized by well-organized but essentially inward-looking charitable endeavors, into a world in which the more outward-going civic ideal of public benefaction was still alive. Hence, he goes on, by a slight but significant shift of emphasis, traditional Christian charity to fellow believers within the Christian community came to be regarded as a public service and as a more general care for the poor performed in return for public privileges. The notion, quote, care for the poor, helped to define the place of the Christian church in Roman society. So as the pagan empire slowly became Christian, this Christian concern for the poor, the widow and the orphan, suddenly these things became more public virtues. If everyone is theoretically a Christian in the Christian empire, then the poor, care for the poor, love for the poor, becomes a little bit more visible, and it becomes more of a public social good to pursue, right? And this really, in a significant sense, is the beginning of secular social awareness, right? Caring for the poor, caring for the disabled, caring for the marginalized, all those things which we consider good things to do, even today in society. All of that was not evident to the classical mind, to the ancient pre-Christian mind. That instinct to care for the poor, the marginalized, the disabled, and so on. That was an instinct given to civilization by the church. Without the church, we would be morally very different people. But anyway, to keep following Peter Brown, he goes on. He says, love of the poor, therefore, did not grow naturally out of the ideals of public beneficence that had dominated the minds and determined the actions of public benefactors in Greek and Roman times. It could only come to the fore as a meaningful public virtue when the ancient civic sense of the community was weakened. In the period of late antiquity, then, Christian and Jewish charity was not simply one accustomed form of generosity among others, practiced with greater zeal than previously, but not otherwise remarkable. It was a new departure. It gained a symbolic weight far out of proportion to its actual extent and efficacy. It was frequently represented as a challenge to the classical pagan image of a, quote, civic community, for it threw open the horizons of society. In a social world modeled on the structures of the classical city, only fellow citizens needed to be clearly visible. In the new model of society, which would dominate the social imagination of the Christian Middle Ages up to and beyond the Reformation, society was a single, all-embracing whole that included city and countryside alike. And so there, that's the effect of these two sort of social visions coming together in the Christian social vision, which had a broader conception of care of the poor, not just the citizenry, took over the social imagination, which meant that not just the urban poor were cared for because they belonged to the citizenry, but the rural poor as well, right? So if you want to know, like one of the great things Christianity gave civilization, it was this. A social awareness that included and humanized those on the margins of society. This was new to the world, right? And again, to move past Christianity, as some of us want to do today, it'll be very interesting to see if this care for those on the margins remains, because again, it's not evident, but that's another discussion. So to talk about this new social imagination, the theological idea funding this new social vision was biblical, of course, right? From Jesus and Paul. And this idea was the idea of the body of Christ, which would, by the time of the Middle Ages, become the Corpus Christianum, right? The Christian empire, so to speak. But as I said, it has its roots in Paul. For example, here in Romans 12. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them, if prophecy, in proportion to our faith, and if service, in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity. So when the empire became Christian, this body of Christ imagery was transposed, so to speak, onto the empire, right? Onto the entire world. Now the entire world was imagined as the body of Christ, or at least potentially so. And so therefore no longer was social concern catered only around a particular tribe, the city-state, or a particular race, but around every human being, So Constantinianism, as they call it, brought a lot of trouble with it, but it also brought this all-encompassing social vision, the effects of which are still with us today. Again, following Peter Brown, he describes this further. He says, rather, what changed in late antiquity was the definition of the bonds of society. Traditional patterns of giving and traditional links of patronage and protection were redirected. New social networks were created and reached out past the traditional core of, quote, citizens to embrace an ill-defined but symbolically charged group of, quote, just the poor. Slowly, over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, the relation between emperors and his subjects, between the different classes of society, became tinged with a new pathos generated within the Christian Church. The relations between the believer and God, subject and emperor, between the weak and the powerful, came to be swallowed up by a single elemental image, the image of the relationship between the poor and the rich, the powerful to whom the poor cried out, not only for alms, but for justice and protection. So slowly, the Greek and the Christian social visions converged, creating the social imagination which enlivened Western civilization up to our own day. Even secular humanists today, even though they're ignorant of the origins of this tradition and sort of foolishly assume that caring for the marginalized and the poor is self-evident. All you have to do is read Nietzsche to know that that's not the case. Even secular humanists value this social imagination that humanizes the marginalized. Like I said, they're just, I think some of them willfully don't want to be honest about its origins. So moving forward, to see what this new social vision looked like on the ground, we need to take a look at a few elements of history and tradition. Often when people talk or write about Catholic social teaching, they'll say that it began with the 19th century, but that's not really the case. Modern church teaching modern church social teaching, I should say, is a distinct period of social doctrine, but the teaching of Leo the 13th, where it often begins for people, and his successors, all of that rests on ancient Christian teaching, which we've been talking about. The modern popes didn't pull this out of thin air. Rather, they were speaking ancient wisdom to a modern problem. So we need to look at the past, right? And in particular to the 4th century here to begin, very quickly to see how these Christian social principles worked themselves out in a time of crisis. And so to dive into the 4th century, let's look. Sometime in around the 360s, late 360s, in modern-day Turkey, that is in Asia Minor, there was a huge drought followed by a huge famine, sub-Saharan proportions, which of course caused a huge humanitarian crisis. In that crisis, not unusual, the instincts among the rich, many of them, was to lock up their gardens and batten down the hatches. Prices went through the roof, and it's in that context that we came across a few Christian bishops who stood up and lashed out and ferociously and passionately preached for the rich to do the right thing. And part of the fruit of this late 4th century crisis and the bishops who stood up to preach the truth is the birth of kind of what we today would call hospitals, and the birth of social action. These bishops were Basil the Great, Saint Basil the Great, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa. You can include John Chrysostom in there, although he was not writing in the context of this famine. These stand out as the great fathers of the early church when it comes to Christian social justice. And these bishops, basically, they demanded that the wealthy open their barns to feed the poor. Basil the Great himself was an extremely wealthy man. And he raised a lot of money and built a huge structure outside the city of Caesarea, where he was bishop, for the sick and the indigent, basically a hospital. And Basil was a student of Egyptian monasticism, and he took this ideal of community that he learned in Egypt and translated it to helping the poor. As I said, creating something like one of the early hospitals of history. But in order to create this movement, these bishops had to enliven the Christian social imagination, basically forcing the rich to see the humanity and Christian brotherhood of the poor and the suffering. And so to dive into these church fathers, just listen to them. Gregory of Nyssa, forcefully. You see these people whose frightful malady has changed them into beasts. In place of fingernails, the disease has caused them to bear pieces of wood on hands and feet. Listen to the rasping wheeze that comes from their chest. He's talking about leprosy. Basil the Great pointing out people suffering from famine. The form shrivels, little by little strength diminishes, flesh stretches across the bones like a spider web. The skin loses its bloom and the rosy appearance fades and blood melts away. The eyes are sunken as if in a casket, like dried up nuts in their shells. The empty belly collapses, conforming itself to the shape of the backbone with any natural elasticity of the bowels, right? So pretty gross. Their goal was to paint a graphic picture for those who dared not even to look at the poor who were suffering. The most important sermon of this era, as far as I'm concerned, is Oration 14 from Gregory of Nazianzus. I defy anybody to read it and not be moved to tears by it. Here is a paragraph from that sermon. Again, Gregory of Nazianzus is forcing his listeners to visualize the suffering of the poor. He says, "There lies before our eyes a dreadful and pathetic sight, one that no one would believe who has not seen it. Human beings alive yet dead, disfigured in almost every part of their bodies, barely recognizable for who they once were or where they came from, or rather the pitiful wreckage of what had once been human beings. By way of identification, they keep calling out the names of their mothers and fathers, brothers, and places of origin. I am the son of so-and-so, so-and-so is my mother, this is my name, you used to be a close friend of mine. And this they do because they cannot be identified from the way they used to look." And again he goes on, "Who is not overcome as their plaintive cries rise in a symphony of lament? What ear can bear the sound? What eye can take the sight? In the hot sun and the dust they writhe at men's feet, and sometimes too they are tormented by biting cold and rain and blasts of wind, and narrowly escape being trampled on only because we find it repugnant to come into contact with them. Their mournful pleas stand in jarring contrast to the sacred chanting within, and their piteous lament forms a counterpoint to the mystic voices." Right? That's powerful. These preachers are trying to get their listeners to visualize and to look at the very people they don't want to look at, right? They want them to visualize the poor. I've always thought perhaps this is why, this is also considered the golden age of Christian preaching, right? They were preachers preaching in a time of great need. But to move on, in these early sermons, we see the principles of Christian social teaching emerge, living in common life with the poor. For again to look at St. Gregory of Nazianzus, see this is how they suffer, and in fact far more wretchedly than I've indicated. These are brothers in God, whether you like it or not. That's my favorite line in the whole sermon of Oration 14. Whose share in nature is the same as ours. Again, Gregory of Nyssa, remember who they are on whom we meditate, on human beings, in no way distinct from our common nature. So the theological principle of Christian social teaching, which is the principle basically at the bottom of everything the church teaches about morality and politics and economics, is that line from Gregory of Nazianzus. These are brothers in God, whether you like it or not, right? The unborn. These are brothers in God, whether you like it or not. Undocumented migrants. These are brothers in God, whether you like it or not. The poor. These are brothers in God, whether you like it or not. That's solidarity, right? The principle we'll see again and again and again and again and again. These are brothers in God, whether you like it or not. In an early sermon of mine when I was a young preacher, I put it this way. If, for example, you're watching the news and you see a family trekking across the Arizona desert, and your first thought when you see that image is Mexican or illegal, I would say, well, then your soul's in jeopardy. Or when you see people gathered, huddled under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas, and your first thought is Haitian and not brother or human or sister, then beware, your soul's in jeopardy, I would say. At the very least, there's more work to do, right? Again, to look at Nazianzus, or rather more importantly, who have some portion as the image of God, just as we do, and who keep it better, wasted though their bodies may be, whose inner nature is put on the same Christ, and who have been entrusted with the same guarantee of the Spirit as we, who have been given the share with us the same laws, prophecies, testaments, liturgies, sacraments, hopes, from Christ, who takes away the sin of the world, died, just as he did for us. So again, solidarity means that we believe that we all, rich and poor alike, share in one common nature, and that we have hope that all people will come to share in the communion of the church, right? And this solidarity demands action, as we'll see. To not act in light of our understanding of solidarity is, these fathers were quite clear, to tempt judgment, right? As Basil and Gregory say. They're from Gregory of Nazianzus. What shall our attitude toward these people be? What shall we do? Shall we neglect them, walk on by? Most certainly not, my brothers. These actions become neither ourselves, the flock of Christ, the Good Shepherd, nor do they become our human nature. As Basil says in the great Homily 8, he says, the person who rushes by such a body, how greatly worthy is he of chastisement? What excess of cruelty will he allow? Should he not be reckoned with the savagery of the beasts, accursed and a homicide? Whoever has it in his power to alleviate this evil, but deliberately opts instead for profit, should be condemned as a murderer. That's some tough stuff. What if you heard that on a Sunday from your preacher, right? You neglect the poor, you're as good as a murderer, Basil says, right? And these fathers go on. They intentionally rattle our sense of decency and decorum. Again, from Gregory of Nazianzus. He says, a man thinks nothing of taking up residence with a murderer and invites an adulterer to share not only his home but his board as well, and chooses a temple robber as his boon companion and becomes friends with those who have mistreated him. Yet from the suffering of the one who has done him no wrong, he turns away as though it were a crime. And so malice wins out over disease, and we embrace viciousness as the mark of a gentleman and reject sympathy as degradation. So we're supposed to be friends with the poor. Jesus made that clear, you'll remember, in Luke's Gospel. But just because they look bad or they smell bad, we're more comfortable, Nazianzus is rather uncomfortably saying to us, we're more comfortable with a showered crook, right? This is still true today, obviously. To move on to John Chrysostom, he says, for most people, when they see someone in hunger, chronic illness, and the extremes of misfortune, do not even allow him a good reputation, but judge his life by his troubles and think that he is surely in such misery because of wickedness. Let us call fortunate not the wealthy, but the virtuous. Let us call miserable not the poor, but the wicked. Let us not regard what is present, but consider what is to come. He goes on, so you, likewise, when you see on earth a man who has encountered the shipwreck of poverty, do not judge him. Do not seek an account of his life, but free him of his misfortune. Why do you make trouble for yourself? God has excused you from all officiousness and meddlesomeness, right? The lesson here is quite clear. Don't judge the poor. Just stop right there before you get ahead. Don't examine them. Chrysostom says, help them. But as I said, these early sermons were designed to motivate. They were designed to raise money for these basileas, as they were called, these centers to care for the poor and the leprous, these sort of early modern hospitals. The love of God, they said, had to be translated into action. And so again, to follow Gregory of Nazianzus, let us therefore purify ourselves through acts of mercy. Let us take the fine soap and wash away the marks of filth and defilement from our souls. He goes on to sort of criticize tremendously, in an especially potent way, the idea that as long as you have your theology right, your morality doesn't really need to follow. This is what Gregory says to that. He says, do you think that compassion is not an obligation upon you, but a matter of choice? Not rule, but recommendation? This is what I myself should very much like to think, but I stand in terror of the left hand and the goats. That's a reference to Matthew 25. They are condemned to take their places on the left, not because they stole or committed sacrilege or fornicated or violated any other taboo, but because they did not serve Christ through the poor, right? So these fathers, they're putting neglect of the poor above all these other sort of moral taboos, right? Here in John Chrysostom, this next passage from his second homily on Lazarus, we see what's called in Catholic social teaching as the universal destination of goods. And its principle describes essentially what Jesus meant when he said we're to make friends, the rich are to make friends with the poor by means of their wealth. The church teaches very clearly that private ownership of goods is essential and should be protected. It's a good thing to have private property. But private ownership is good, the church teaches, insofar as those goods are shared with the poor and for the common good, right? The church does not lock in that sense. And again, this principle has its origin in the Bible, and here's John Chrysostom passionately describing it. He says, "For our money is the Lord's, however we may have gathered it. If we provide for those in need, we shall obtain great plenty. This is why God allowed you to have more, not to waste on prostitutes, drink, fancy food, clothes, expensive clothes, and all other kinds of indolence, but for you to distribute to those in need. The rich man is a kind of steward of the money which is owed for distribution to the poor. He is directed to distribute it to his fellow servants who are in want. So if he spends more on himself than his need requires, he will pay the harshest penalty hereafter. For his own goods are not his own, but belong to his servants." If you want to know what John Chrysostom thinks about discretionary income. Now, the debate over private property was a big one and a long one in the early centuries of the church. Ultimately, the church definitively taught that private ownership was a good thing, but as I said, private ownership was not absolute under any circumstances. Ultimately, just as the land, the Holy Land, belonged to the Israelites, your property belongs to God, not to you, right? So private ownership should be viewed really simply as one form of stewardship. To look at Gregor of Nyssa and Basil, illustrating how our goods should be used, Nyssa says this. He says, "Be generous on behalf of your unfortunate brethren, that you withhold that which you withhold from your belly, give to the poor. Let a fear of God level out the differences between you and them. With self-control, carefully avoid two contrary evils, your own gorging and the hunger of your brethren. You will say, 'I am poor, me too.' So it is. Nevertheless, give. Give what you have. God does not demand what is beyond your means." And there with Basil, he says, "But you be strong a little in the catastrophe, and do not change direction on account of the waves. Neither cast off those readily portable virtues that you carried with you. Cling twice as tenaciously to thanksgiving as you do to luxury." Right? And he goes on, "Are you poor? There is someone poorer than you. You have enough bread for 10 days. Another has enough for one. As a good and kind-hearted person, make your surplus equal by distributing it to the needy. Do not shrink from giving the little that you have. Do not treat your own calamity as if it's worse than the common suffering. Even if you possess only one loaf of bread, and the beggar stands at the door, bring the one loaf out of the storeroom, and, presenting it to the hands lifted up toward heaven, offer this merciful and considerate prayer. One loaf which you see, O Lord, and the problem is evident, but as for me, I prefer your commandment to myself, and I give of the little that I have to the starving brother. For you also give to your servant in trouble. I know your great goodness, and I also confidently believe in your power. For you do not defer your grace for another time, but disperse your gifts when you wish. And if you were to speak and act in this way, the bread which you give out of your own scarcity would become seed for planting. It would bear rich fruit, a pledge of sustenance, a patron of mercy." So here we see what Paul meant, you'll remember, when he talked about giving according to your means and even sometimes beyond it. This militates against our instincts to tighten our fists in difficult times. We look at our checkbook and we sometimes think, no, I just can't. The fathers, the church, the Bible say that Christian giving actually is sacrificial, not something born only out of surplus, right? And also I should note that we're talking about giving to the poor here, not necessarily giving to the church. And there's this idea that that there was this redemptive almsgiving, right? That was possible. This commercium spirituale, right? That when money was given to the poor, the poor were giving prayers and grace to the giver, right? So you see there in Basil, "O poor one, lend to the rich God," right? That was a very live and powerful idea in ancient Christianity. To move on, it's not inappropriate, again, just following the way the fathers spoke, to have a little fear here, right? These early fathers were not shy about inspiring fear in regard to neglecting the poor. And kind of think that's okay, right? I once heard a sermon where a priest, a very well-to-do priest, said, I'm sure God's not going to torture us for our sins, very nonchalantly. Now I know what this priest was trying to accomplish as a preacher. I get it. But I'm always a bit wary of overconfident, well-to-do preachers telling overconfident, well-to-do parishioners not to worry. Be careful of that, right? Fear, the fathers would tell us, can be a good thing. So let's look at Basil the Great for that. He says, he says, "Think reasonably about that which is and that which shall come, and what you might lose through shameful profit. Your body, the thing which you recognize, life, will desert you. Although you will have arrived at the revealed presence of the expected judge, you will have shut yourself off from the gift of the honors and the heavenly glory. Instead of a long and happy life, you will be opening the everlasting fire, Gehenna, punishments, and the bitter things in eternal agony." And he finishes this haunting homily by saying, "Do not dismiss me as if I am like a mother nurse, frightening you with some imaginative monster, as they often do in very young children. These are no fables, but an oration proclaimed with the voice of truth. Know too truly, according to the public proclamation of the gospel, that no jot or tittle will pass away. Even the body hidden in the coffin will rise, and the soul cut off by death will again dwell in the body. And sharp scrutiny of life's events will come into one's head, testifying. The soul herself will testify from the conscience. May it be measured out to each according to his worth by the righteous judge, to whom is due glory, strength, and worship unto the ages of ages. Amen." Right, so think of judgment, think of the end, Basil said. And don't let yourself off the hook just that easily. So that's the fathers. Now we need to fast forward several centuries to modern social teaching. A lot of economic history separates the fourth from the 19th centuries, and so we don't have time, obviously, to talk about the rise of the profit economy, the mendicant movement, the pre-industrial economy, the mercantile capitalism, and so on and so forth. We need to focus really just on the 19th century and on modern Catholicism, when modern Catholic social teaching began. We do need, though, to talk about economics just a bit. In the late 17th to 19th century, we see the rise of capitalism, and the ideology of capitalism, the ideology of profit, which is that you want to make more than you spend. And so how do you do that? Well, you sell more than you buy, or you sell a product at a higher cost than the cost of what it took you to make the product. Thus, if you want production to give you the most profit, you want the cost of production to be as low as possible. Therefore, you want the cheapest labor, getting the most out of your labor that you can get. You want the best, obviously then you want the best sort of regulatory benefits for your exports. You want the whole system to benefit profits, right? But this pressure to reduce the cost of production, which is a feature of capitalism, often puts a lot of pressure. And in the history of capitalism, we've seen a lot of inhumane pressure on labor and on the families of laborers, right? Only in the modern era, for example, did capitalism bring with it the 7-day work week with 18-hour days, right? That's the feature of capitalism. Whereas in the medieval period, for example, work was broken up by religious festivals, by Sabbaths, by seasons, by folk rituals. All of that was slowly degraded and dismantled with the rise of modern capitalism. Because the final goal of the economy became profit and the making and gathering of more capital. So these human activities, these activities of culture and family life and religion, they took a back seat to the goal of profit, right? They were boxed out of the timesheet. And so these, as I said, these old cultural pillars of human life were sidelined, radically altered, degraded, eliminated altogether, mostly. And when this happens, right? Why? Because you got to get the most out of your labor, so you got to get them working, so much. When this begins to happen, and those human and cultural activities begin to feel the pressure and to collapse and fade away, when this happens, the church recognized early human life itself gets sidelined, radically altered, or sometimes eliminated altogether. So the worker and his family life become viewed simply as an instrument or as a cog in the wheel, or something that needs to be sort of boxed in, reduced as much as possible for the sake of profit, right? To get the most out of your labor. This is rampant capitalism at its most extreme. This is obviously a sweeping simplification. The reaction of capitalism, of course, came by way of Karl Marx, who argued that we need an equal distribution of the means of production and of capital, and government or an organized proletariat should take power and distribute the means of production and capital equally, which of course when practiced has often just been a disaster. Read, for instance, Orwell's Animal Farm. So again, these are sweeping simplifications. But between these two modern ideologies, capitalism on the one hand and Marxism on the other, where does the Catholic Church stand? What does she endorse, capitalism or Marxism? You'll be surprised, maybe, that the Catholic Church comes out for neither, really. Rather, she points to the dignity of the human being and human life. And she reasserts that human life is the proper goal of any politics or any economics. The Church teaches that we should remember that no economic ideology or policy can subjugate the human person. If profit is your goal, but in that process you ruin human beings, for example, by not allowing your workers to live their human family life or to achieve their full human worth, then that system is immoral and should be corrected. Marxism, on the opposite end, doesn't allow the human to be fully human either, because it doesn't allow the person to cultivate his or her own goods and to share them, which destroys the experience of solidarity, which is properly human and Christian. It destroys social love. Again, to be extremely simple about it. For example, if I see my brother in need and I give him a share of what I have from my own possessions, I'm expressing and creating social love or communion. But if neither of us has anything of our own, we're not able to give anything to each other and show our love for each other. right? If I gave someone my own $20 bill, that person would love me more, for example, than if I gave him a $20 check from the government, right? Destroy social communion. So anyway, very simple description. So that's what the church does. It doesn't endorse either. The church simply says, remember the human. And so in the 19th century, at the height of child labor, industrialization, budding Marxism, Pope Leo XIII emerges and says something very simple but very profound. And this is what he says in Rerum Novarum in 1891. He says, "But with man it is wholly different. He possesses on the one hand the full perfection of the animal being, and hence enjoys, at least as much as the rest of animal kind, the fruition of things material." So simply, Leo XIII reminded the world that the human person and human life are the proper ends of economic activity, not profit or Marxist ideology. And this reassertion of human value should, in theory, have an effect on the relationship of labor and employer, right? So we're following Leo XIII here. He says, of these duties, the following bind the proletarian and the worker: fully and faithfully to perform the work which has been freely and equitably agreed upon, never to injure the property nor to outreach the person of an employer, never to resort to violence in defending their own cause, nor to engage in riot or disorder, and to have nothing to do with the men of evil principles who work upon the people with artful promises of great results, and to excite foolish hopes which usually end in useless regrets and grievous loss. The following duties bind the wealthy owner and the employer: not to look upon their work people as their bondsmen, slaves, but to respect in every man his dignity as a person ennobled by Christian character, right? So some would say, I've accused this of being a little bit naive, obviously. It's ideal, definitely. There's a desire to preserve social order, to resist the breakdown of society, which becomes violent very quickly. But then there's the challenge for the employer to remember the humanity of the employee, right? To remember his dignity. And so, any economic or political system must not devalue or crush human culture. We see this again in Leo. He says, they are reminded that according to natural reason and Christian philosophy, working for gain is creditable, not shameful to man, since it enables him to earn an honorable livelihood. But to misuse men as though they were things in pursuit of gain, or to value them solely for their physical powers, this is truly shameful and inhuman. Again, justice demands that in dealing with the working man, religion and the good of his soul must be kept in mind. Hence, the employer is bound to see that the worker has time for his religious duties, that he be not exposed to corrupting influences and dangerous occasions, and that he be not led away to neglect his home and family and to squander his earnings, right? You hear all this, this is in the background of people talking about living wage, people talking about decent work hours. Leo XIII is saying something quite progressive here, that you have to let your employers be human, and being human entails having a family, raising them, educating them, going to church, going to mosques, respecting their religious and spiritual lives. So, to move on, decades before Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, before America completely awoke to the evils of child labor, right? There were state child labor laws, sporadically in the country that were even more sporadically enforced throughout the 19th century, but the Fair Labor Standards Act didn't happen actually until 1938. So before America, woke up to the issue, the church spoke up for workers' rights. You see here Leo XIII, he says, Furthermore, the employer must never tax his workpeople beyond their strength or employ them in work unsuited to their sex and age. His great and principal duty is to give everyone what is just. Doubtless, before deciding whether wages are fair, many things have to be considered, but wealthy owners and all masters of labor should be mindful of this, that to exercise pressure upon the indigent and the destitute for the sake of gain, and to gather one's profit out of the need of another, is condemned by all laws, human and divine. To defraud one of the wages that are his due is a great crime, which cries to the avenging anger of heaven. Behold, the hire of the laborers, which by fraud has been kept back by you, crieth, and the cry of them hath entered into the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath. Lastly, the rich must religiously refrain from cutting down the workman's earnings, whether by force, by fraud, or by usurious dealing, and with all the greater reason, because the laboring man is, as a rule, weak and unproductive, and because his slender means should not, in proportion of their scantiness, be accounted sacred. So think of that day laborer, at the gas station waiting to be picked up in the morning. Do you think he's receiving a just wage? A wage that helps him be a human person with a family? Or is that a wage that's probably designed to maximize profit, right? It's the responsibility of the employer, Leo XIII is saying clearly, to take care of the worker. Why? Because the worker is the weaker person. The worker is vulnerable, right? So again, to iterate, the principle of Catholic social teaching, a great quote from John 23rd. He says, the permanent validity of the Catholic Church's social teaching admits of no doubt. This teaching rests on one basic principle. Individual human beings are the foundation, the cause, and the end of every social institution. That is necessarily so, for men are by nature social beings. So again, any political or economic activity or institution that crushes the human person or culture is evil, period, whether it's capitalist or socialist, right? And the church is quite clear, you can't blame the free market for that. Whenever we, blame an inhuman mechanism for our moral failures, the church doesn't buy that, right? So this is the church's mediating position between capitalism and Marxism. It's summarized in Vatican II here in Gaudium et Spes. He says, since economic activity, for the most part, implies the associated work of human beings, any way of organizing and directing it may be detrimental to any working men and women, would be wrong and inhuman. It happens too often, however, even in our days, that workers are reduced to the level of being slaves to their own work. This is by no means justified by the so-called economic laws, right? So that's a criticism of the invisible hand free market excuse. The entire process of productive work, therefore, must be adapted to the needs of the person and to his way of life, above all to his domestic life, especially in the respect of mothers and families, always with due regard for sex and age. The opportunity, moreover, should be granted to workers to unfold their own abilities and personality through the performance of their work, applying their time and strength to their employment with a due sense of responsibility. They should also enjoy sufficient rest and leisure to cultivate their familial, cultural, social, and religious life. They should also have opportunity to freely develop their energies and potentialities, which perhaps cannot bring too much fruition in their professional work. Right, so things like family leave, right? How do we take care of mothers who have just had their child, right, or families? All of this is envisioned in Catholic social teaching because everything should be geared to so that humans can be human and families can be families, right? So the church does not endorse, no matter who tells you, pure free market capitalism, which justifies injustice by so-called economic laws. It just doesn't, right? Rather, simply put, Catholic social teaching tells us that we work to live, right? We don't live to work. And that's a lesson we Americans have always had difficulty with, right? moving on to JP2, to John Paul II, he says, what is in question is the advancement of persons, not just the multiplying of things people can use. It is a matter, as a contemporary philosopher has said, and the Council has stated, not so much of having more, but of being more. Very important that. Indeed, there is already a real perceptible danger that while man's dominion over the world of things is making enormous advances, he should lose the essential threads of his dominion, and in various ways let his humanity be subjected to the world and become himself something subject to manipulation in many ways, even if the manipulation is not perceptible directly through the whole of the organization of community life, through the production system and through the pressure from the means of social communication. Moving on with JP2. The man cannot relinquish himself or the place in the visible world that belongs to him. He cannot become the slave of things, the slave of economic systems, the slave of production, the slave of his own products. A civilization purely materialistic in outline condemns man to such slavery, even if it at times, no doubt, this occurs contrary to the intentions and the very premises of its pioneers, right? No matter what your good intentions are. The present solicitude for man certainly has its roots in this problem. It is not a matter here merely of giving an abstract answer to the question, who is man? It is a matter of the whole of the dynamism of life and civilization. It is a matter of the meaningfulness of the various initiatives of everyday life, and also the premises for many civilization programs, political programs, economic ones, social ones, state ones, and many others. So JP2 is criticizing a civilization, quote, purely materialistic. That's a critique of Marxism. As like North Korea puts on display. Looking again at JP2, he says economic development, with every factor in its adequate functioning, must be constantly programmed and realized within a perspective of universal joint development of each individual and people. Otherwise, the category of, quote, economic progress becomes in isolation a superior category, subordinating the whole of human existence to its partial demands, suffocating man, breaking up society, and ending by entangling itself in its own tensions and excesses. So this is the beginning of what some Catholic economists call the economics of communion, what Paul has called integral development, or Christian humanism. So everything's got to serve the human flourishing, right? Individually and socially. And so the question is, we live in a global society. So how does this idea, which has its beginnings in this Hebrew covenant Christian body of Christ love, how does that concept, that ancient concept, influence global economics, right? What is our responsibility to quote unquote third world, or the developing world, and also how should we, as a rich country, for example, or a rich corporation, how should we interact with other peoples and other cultures in the global economy, right? Should we take into consideration things like culture and religion and education, folk wisdom and custom? Should we mine the indigenous sacred lands because they have a mineral that charges our iPhones? What do you do there, right? Should we take all of that human stuff into account when we're making economic decisions? The Catholic Church says undoubtedly, absolutely, right? To say that the capitalist market will take care of all this by itself, the invisible hand argument, that's not a position that the Catholic Church would endorse at all, right? Why? Because you're letting your moral decisions be made by an inhuman mechanism, and it's mostly just a rubbish excuse. So, to conclude, right, with a good summary of the Church's mediating view of economics, right, between capitalism purely and Marxism, is her insistence that we Catholics do something about it, right? The Church if she could say anything to you, would be adamantly do the right thing, right? Do not exploit, right? Here from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The Church has rejected the totalitarian and atheistic ideologies associated in modern times with, quote, communism or socialism. She has likewise refused to accept, in the practice of capitalism, individualism, and the absolute primacy of the law of the marketplace over human labor, right? So that's against the invisible hand argument. Regulating the economy solely by centralized planning perverts the basis of social bonds. Regulating it solely by the law of the marketplace fails social justice, right? So that's hammering away at capitalism and Marxism. For there are many human needs which cannot be satisfied by the market. Reasonable regulation of the marketplace and economic initiatives in keeping with a just hierarchy of values and a view to the common good is to be commended, right? Pretty common sense stuff, right? For those who aren't ideological. Pope Benedict XVI, hammering home the same point. He says, both capitalism and Marxism promised to point out the path for the creation of just structures, and they declared that these, once established, would function by themselves. They declared that not only would they have no need of any prior individual morality, but they would promote a communal morality. And this ideological promise has been proved false. The facts have clearly demonstrated. The Marxist system, where it found its way into government, not only left a sad heritage of economic and ecological destruction, but also a painful oppression of souls. And we can also see the same thing happening in the West, where the distance between rich and poor is growing constantly and giving rise to a worrying degradation of personal dignity through drugs, alcohol, and deceptive illusions of happiness. So, again, it's not rocket science. It's just fair, right? So finally, a few points from the Catechism, which should all, after everything we've talked about, should just kind of make sense. From Catechism. God blesses those who come to the aid of the poor and rebukes those who turn away from them. Give to him who begs from you, do not refuse him who would borrow from you. You receive without pay, give without pay. It is by what they have done to the poor that Jesus Christ will recognize his chosen ones. When the poor have good news preached to them, it is a sign of Christ's presence. Again, the Church's love for the poor is a part of her constant tradition. This love is inspired by the gospel of the Beatitudes, of the poverty of Jesus, and of his concern for the poor. Love for the poor is even one of the motives of the duty of working so as to be able to give to those in need. And why do you work? To go on vacation or to help people. The works of mercy, in the next paragraph, are charitable actions by which we come to the aid of our neighbor in his spiritual and bodily necessities, instructing, advising, consoling, comforting our spiritual works of mercy, as are forgiving and bearing wrongs patiently. The corporal works of mercy consist especially in feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and imprisoned, and in burying the dead. And again, it is in its various forms, material deprivation, unjust oppression, physical and psychological illness and death, human misery, is the obvious sign of the inherited condition of frailty and need for salvation in which man finds himself as a consequence of original sin. This misery elicited the compassion of Christ, the Savior, who willingly took it upon himself and identified himself with the least of his brethren. Hence, those who are oppressed by poverty are the object of a preferential love on the part of the Church, which since her origin and in spite of the failings of many of her members, has not ceased to work for their relief, defense, and liberation through numerous works of charity, and which remain indispensable always and everywhere. And so very last, this attitude of social justice, which the Church has always expressed, has always invited ridicule and scorn, right, from all sides. This is nothing new, and quite frankly, the Church can take it, and so therefore so should we. And so to finish with the words of John Paul II, he says, it will perhaps provoke new accusations against the Church. The Church, however, has no weapons at her disposal apart from those of the Spirit, of the Word and love, cannot renounce her proclamation of the Word in season and out of season. For this reason, she does not cease to implore each side of the two, and to beg everybody in the name of God and the name of man, do not kill, Do not prepare destruction and extermination for men. Think of your brothers and sisters who are suffering in hunger and misery. Respect each one's dignity and freedom. So that's the final word, right? What's the church's social teaching? It all boils down to this idea, which began in the Hebrew Scriptures, which progressed all through history, and which stands today. Really is the most consistent voice in our world for remembering the human dignity of the person, right? And again, as I said a couple times ago, the church irritatingly, consistently asks that question: who is your brother? Who is your sister? Who is my neighbor? These are brothers in God, whether we like it or not, right? Whether they're poor, they're unborn, documented or undocumented, and that's the key to what we call Catholic social teaching. Our next discussion will be about the gospel of life, which is again a question which comes from the question, who is my neighbor? Till then, bye.